Family history writers have begun adding historical context to their family stories, but there's a problem that few people are talking about. Instead of bringing the story to life, those historical fun facts can end up feeling like window dressing. In this video, I'll show you what's going wrong and how to turn historical context into something your ancestor actually experienced. So what's the problem? Many writers are stuffing historical details in their stories, but they're not actually building those details into the tale itself. And I'll be honest, I struggle with this too. But when you and I get this right, our stories stop feeling like a collection of facts and start becoming something our ancestors actually lived through. That's when we begin to build meaningful scenes. Here's a version of historical context that sounds good. A rooster crows across the fields as dawn breaks. Dust rises from the morning breeze, rolling over freshly plowed fields. A young man is already up, boots caked with dirt, tending to the land. That was actually fun to read. But let's be honest, it feels vivid. But the problem? It could be almost anywhere, any decade, any farm. In the spring of 1860, America was holding its breath. A presidential election loomed with growing talk of secession if the wrong man won. Newspapers carried debates about tariffs, slavery, and rights of expanding states. Across the country, families were making plans, some hopeful, others cautious. Notice how we're somewhere. Editorials speculated about Abraham Lincoln's chances, while farmers near Franklin County grumbled about crop prices and the railroad's creeping expansion. Notice how we are somewhere specific, in a specific moment in time, 1860 Franklin County. Now, we could get even more specific into a home, and that's important, but we're inside the kinds of conversation and concerns people were actually carrying around with them. So once we stop being generic, we have to realize that building a scene is not about building a list. Because here's what many of us do. We gather historical facts and then we line up in our story, something like this. In the 1840s, America was expanding westward. Railroads were beginning to develop in Ohio. Franklin County had fertile farmland, rivers, and growing communities. Now, these are all good facts, and if you followed the recipe for writing family history principle, they're helpful and they're accurate. But if you want to take your story to the next level, they can't just sit there because right now they're not connected and they're not being experienced. Once again, we look at in the early 1840s, America was straining at its seams. The nation's borders had pushed westward and talk of expansion filled newspapers. As those national changes unfolded, Ohio was shifting in its own way. Railroads had only just begun to stretch across the state. Tucked into the southeastern corner of Franklin County, Madison Township grew quietly along the bend of the Socio River. Axes rang out in the early morning as oak and walnut trees fell, making way for fields and farms. Now do you notice the difference? We're still using the same kinds of facts, but instead of listing them, we are layering them. And if you've been around the channel long enough, I just did the zoom out and zoom in technique that we've mentioned before. And of course, there will be a link in the description box if you are unfamiliar with that technique. The revision here is to create narrative with the facts, not just tick them off a list. But even with a well-built scene like this, there's one more step we can take. And I'll be honest, this is an advanced technique, and it's one I'm still trying to revise toward. But when we do, it shifts the story from a well-written scene into an immersive experience. So what does that look like? It comes down to this. Who is your ancestor in that moment? And how would they understand what's happening around them? So let's go back to one of our earlier facts. The railroads were expanding across Ohio. Now, that might be how we describe it, but William wouldn't have experienced railroads that way, especially as a young child. He wouldn't think in terms of transportation systems or economic growth, especially for something that he hasn't experienced before. Instead, he might notice something like this. Strange metal tracks were being laid across the land, roads that the horse or wagon could not travel on. Grown men spoke about them often, using a word he didn't quite understand, railroad. He didn't grow up with Thomas the Tank Engine. He grew up with horse and buggy, and then the metal tracks came. Notice how this was the same historical fact, but it is a completely different experience. And when we shift that experience towards him being a child, that's when magic happens. So for an adult, railroads might represent faster travel, new opportunity, changing markets, noise pollution, and even uncertainty about the future. So the fact doesn't change, the experience did. We write from what we know about history instead of how our ancestors understood them in the moment. But when we shift to their perspective, your story stops sounding like a research report and starts sounding like a life being lived. And you're adding layers of immersion for your readers. So as you're writing, try this. Take one historical fact and ask yourself, what would my ancestor have seen or heard or wondered about this? That's when your story starts to come to life. Now, if you've made it this far, you'll want to know this video is part of the series called Write With Me, where I walk through how I'm writing William Townsend's story step by step. You will find the full playlist in the description, along with the current draft chapters on my blog, if you'd like to follow along a little more closely. I'd love to hear from you. What's one historical detail you're trying to figure out how to write into your story? Drop it in the comments and let's walk through the process together. Remember to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe on your way out. Then go write your family history.